Well, we've made it to the end. And as I am more than a year out past the publication of the Making of Biblical Womanhood, I think even more than my conversation about inerrancy, my discussion about Arianism, my Paul chapter, and even my discussion of the ESV, I think this chapter got me in the most trouble because in it is a call to action. Because biblical womanhood is more than just an idea. It is more than just disagreeing over whether we should fully submerge in baptism or sprinkle. It is bigger than disagreeing about music or whether or not our clergy wear robes. Biblical womanhood hurts women. I told you as we discussed the first chapter that one of the things I did not discuss at the time was why I did not nuance the different types of complementarianism. I do know that many women and men live in complementarian systems and treat each other with dignity and respect. I know that many women flourish as teachers and leaders in complementarian spaces that allow it. This is complementarianism at its best. But I also know it is not the only side. So in this last chapter, for my discussion of it, I want to start with something. I want to talk about something I left out of my Paul chapter. And it is why the Making of Biblical Womanhood matters. Complementarianism is not just about relationships between women and men. It is part of a system that oppresses women. In the 2nd century AD, the pregnant wife of a prosperous Greek politician died from a vicious assault. Her name was Regula, and she was born into an affluent Roman family in 125 AD. She married the Greek politician Herodes Atticus, also from an affluent family, around 140, when she was 15. And 20 years later, when she was 8 months pregnant with their 6th child, she died from a brutal beating, which included a fatal kick to her stomach. Everyone knew who killed her. It was her husband's freedman. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, remember the kindly emperor portrayed by Richard Harris in Gladiator? Marcus Aurelius found the freedman guilty of administering the lethal kick. It also seems clear that the freedman did not act alone. He had been ordered by Herodes, Regula's husband, to beat her. As a contemporary source recorded, quote, a murder charge was brought against Herodes in this way. When his wife Regula was 8 months pregnant, he ordered his freedman to beat her for trivial reasons. She died in premature childbirth from a blow to her abdomen. This is a case of domestic abuse that resulted in murder. A wife was beaten to death by the order of her husband. An unborn child, just weeks from birth, was killed by a father's command. What makes this story of domestic abuse even more horrific is that Regula's husband, although charged and tried for the murder of his wife, was acquitted by the Roman senatorial court. He went free. He was a member of the imperial family, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius intervened on his behalf. Might make you think differently about Richard Harris's portrayal. Yes, Marcus Aurelius was the same emperor who agreed that Herodes had committed the murder. Neither Herodes nor his freedmen suffered consequences for Regula's death. Quite the opposite, actually, as they became wealthier and more prosperous, inheriting her property. Herodes seized the vast property of his dead wife, managing it as his own and prospering from it until eventually Regula's only surviving child inherited. Herodes also lavished wealth and status on the freedman's family, thus creating a situation in which the convicted murderer of Regula directly benefited from her death. I often assign Regula's story in my upper-level women's history course at Baylor. The text makes a significant impression on my students. Questions just spill from them. How in the world was Herodes acquitted? Why in the world did the Roman legal system provide so few protections for battered women? Why were women in the ancient world so disempowered that their voices, just like Regula's, could not be heard? How did a woman who was so powerful and wealthy in her own right end up in such a desperate and deadly domestic situation? How could this happen? The answer is both simple and horrible. The ancient Roman world taught that women belonged under male authority. Regula belonged to her husband. Her unborn child belonged to her husband. According to Roman law, he had the legal authority of life and death over everyone in his household. And so he was acquitted for the murder of his pregnant wife. This is patriarchy at its ugliest. Roman legal theory evolved from the Greek world, assumed the weakness and light-mindedness of the female sex. Roman law used physical characteristics to separate men from women, relegating non-male bodies to a limited and inferior status. Ideas characterizing women as less than men translated into the legal treatment of women as less than men. Because women were considered less intellectually and emotionally capable than men, women needed male guardianship throughout the duration of their lives. That is exactly what Aristotle wrote in his Politics. Quote, "The male is by nature fitter for command than the female, just as the older and full-grown is superior to the younger." Indeed, if you want to sum up Aristotle's approach to men and women, it lies in the questions he directs about them. Aristotle wanted to know what man is, but only what women are for. Of course, Regula's story is extreme. How patriarchy impacted the lives of Roman women varied. Some women had good husbands with happy marriages and control over their finances and family. Some women gained freedom from male guardianship through legal loopholes, becoming powerful property owners in their own right. And some women, like Regula, lived with brutal husbands and died terrible deaths. Because Roman patriarchy was built on the idea of hierarchy between the sexes, the subordination of one sex to the other, the potential for violence and abuse existed alongside the potential for comfort and happiness. How women experienced patriarchy was less about the choices they made and more about the circumstances in which they lived. A woman could be lucky. Her husband could love and treat her well, and she could benefit from the respect Romans afforded her position as a matron. Other women were not so lucky. For Regula, despite her considerable economic and social resources, her husband ultimately proved the most powerful force in her life. I find that Christians today just don't get how precarious patriarchy is for women. The social system of patriarchy was a constant in the Roman Empire, affecting the life of each and every woman. For some of these women, the idea that they ranked less than men cost little, just the backdrop to their everyday routines, even making life more comfortable for them and their children. For other Roman women, the logical outcome of ideas that taught they were permanently subordinate to men cost them much more, sometimes as much as their lives. Let's think about this in the context of our modern churches. As I emphasize in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, complementarianism subordinates women. For some women, their lives are fine. This affects them little. Their children grow up happy with loving parents who care for them. For other women, they aren't so lucky. Just last week, as we are recording this, the Houston Chronicle took away the paywall from the articles that they have written on the sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention. Hundreds and hundreds of women who, like Regula, got the worst that Christian patriarchy had to offer. When women come to me and say, my life's not so bad, patriarchy doesn't affect me, it's a beautiful vision, I say, I'm so glad for you. I am very happy that that is your experience. But as Christians, shouldn't we judge a theology not only on the best outcome, but also on the worst? Where does your theology lead? A theology that teaches that women are eternally subordinated under men simply because of their sex, and there is nothing women can do to overcome that subordination. This theology teaches that women are in some way less than men. And this idea matters. So now that you've journeyed to the end of the book, you may not agree with me. You may be uncomfortable with many of the things that you found. You may be wanting to learn more. Or you may suddenly think how much your life and upbringing makes sense now. However you ended the journey, I still want to thank you for having read it. What I hope you take away is that theology that teaches women are subordinate to men is bigger than simply a minor theological disagreement. It matters in the lives of women. And however you decide, I hope you never forget that.